endocrine system. Whoops. Endocrine system. There we go. Endocrine system. This is a system that doesn't get a lot of attention in the earlier grades, but it's quite an important one for, especially when we're talking about homeostasis, right? All of these systems we're talking about them under that umbrella of how they help with the homeostatic processes and keeping things in check. So essentially, this is the system of glands throughout the body. Glands, and of course the hormones that these glands produce. So the hormones are chemicals that the glands produce, whose purpose is to circulate through the body and then cause something else to happen somewhere else. So they're messenger systems in a way, but not just messengers, they're also activators because they have a certain shape, right? And their shape can interact with cells on their membranes and cause things to happen. So hormones are control molecules that can be secreted. We're going to get into detail on all the different glands and some of them, not all, but some of the hormones that are, most important or most common, a selective sort of survey of hormones. But first we're going to just talk about, in general, how the system sort of works. Kind of a general sort of situation. Hormones can be of different types of molecules. Okay? Hormones can be, so hormones, let's write this down. Hormones can be proteins. They can be amines. They could be glycoproteins. They could be steroids, which are lipids. What else? I'll make sure I don't forget any. Steroids, lipids, amines, peptides, proteins or peptides. Peptides are essentially just smaller little chunks of protein, right? They're still an amino acid combination, but they're usually quite small. No, they're not amino acids. They're molecules that have an amine functional group. Amino acids are a kind of amine, but there are many others, right? Peptides, glycoproteins, I think that's, those are the most common ones anyway. So these hormones are all different molecules, but you can see from this list that they're also fairly complex molecules. They're not like H2O or anything. They're quite complicated. So they have very intricate shapes, which will allow them to do their various jobs. The other thing that's important is that each of these types of molecules has a different solubility. So one of the important things to remember about molecules is that some are lipid soluble. In particular, the steroids, for instance, are lipid soluble. Not just the steroids, but so they're lipid soluble, or I guess you could say they are insoluble to lipids. Lipid soluble molecules tend to be nonpolar, remember? And so we'll just put water soluble, which tend to be more polar molecules. And that's important because remember that if these hormones are going to interact with cells, they have to get into the cell to do their job. Somehow they have to get across the cell membrane. And they can either do it by sliding right through the membrane if they're lipid soluble, or they can do it by sort of activating a site on the membrane which connects to a chemical process inside. We'll see that in a minute. Typically, any hormone that has to access the nucleus of a cell, because its job is to do something to DNA, to maybe initiate the transcription of a protein or something, it, of course, has to be able to slide right through membranes to get in there. So typically, steroids and things can slide through the membranes and get into the nucleus, whereas other ones can't. Doesn't mean they can't act. It just means they have to have a different mechanism with which they can access. Okay, so first there are some sort of basic ways that these things can act before we get into the details. So there's a sort of a simple process that some of them follow. The simplest process is, I'll just outline it like in flowchart form. Begins with some kind of stimulus. Okay, your glucose levels have dropped in your bloodstream, let's say. The stimulus results in a protein receptor being produced. In this case, it would be something called glucagon. It's actually, no, this would probably be insulin at this point. So a protein, receptor protein. The receptor protein would then bind to an endocrine cell, which is a cell that's in a particular gland. The endocrine cell in the gland would be making a hormonal substance. In this case, it might be glucagon. That hormonal substance would be released into the bloodstream. Through capillary action. Capillaries acting. So we'll put some arrows here. When that hormone reaches the target cell, whatever it's trying to affect. I'll go back up in a second. I'll tell you everything in a second. Just let me finish the picture and then I'll go back. Okay? So those red dots from the bloodstream would then affect a target cell. The target effectors. Remember, with homeostatic mechanisms, there's an effector which causes something to happen, and then that would elicit some kind of response, whatever that response might be. Okay, so that's the simplest one. Now I'll go back up and let you catch up to me. So, stimulus, a receptor protein, which activates the endocrine cell. Okay, so in the case of glucose building up in the system, you would get the increasing concentrations of some kind of molecule, whatever it could be, would cause the endocrine cell to secrete these little red dots. So you asked me what they were. The little red dots are basically whatever, they would be the hormone, whatever the hormone is. So the little red dots would be the actual hormone. Whoops, red dots. Hormones secreted by the endocrine cells. Those hormones flow through the bloodstream and they get to the other cells in the body, whatever that message is going to be. Remember, we're just talking generally here. We'll look at specific ones shortly. Right? Response. Hormones, response, hormones secreted. Yeah. We're down here now. So that's the simplest way that it could happen. But, so this is what we call a simple endocrine pathway. It's basically direct stimulation of the endocrine cell to secrete a hormone, which then travels through the blood and directly stimulates target cells or target receptor cells, effector cells, I mean, and then elicits some kind of response. But sometimes there's another extra control level added. Sometimes we want the brain involved. Yep. Yes. Exactly. There's basically two more. That one involves the brain regulating the process, and then the other involves the brain regulating the process, but it's a kind of a double-step process. So we'll see how those differ. We good now? Okay. Okay, let me just... Okay. So the next sort of pathway is what we call a neurohormone pathway. So this would be a simple neurohormone pathway. Stay with me. You guys with me? Okay. So it's the same idea. We start with a stimulus of some kind. The stimulus, but instead of a receptor protein, what the stimulus is it's a sensory neuron. The stimulus activates a neuron. So let's just draw this weird little... And the neuron would follow a chain of nerves. Neuron. So it could be a neuron in your finger, and then the signal would follow up a chain of nerves all the way through your spinal cord up to your brain, where it would actually interact with a part of the brain. And this part of the brain, it's usually the hypothalamus. Or it could also be the posterior pituitary. We're going to learn all these different glands later. So, or pituitary. So put an or in there. One of those sections of the brain. These are the brain sections that tend to regulate hormonal control. And so what they do is they secrete some kind of neurotransmitter or a cell that so I'm going to put little boxes here. It's a neurochemical. Which then enters the bloodstream. Okay, once it's in the bloodstream, maybe I can just go over here. I'll just save some space and go up here. Once we hit the bloodstream, this then affects the target cells. Blue. It doesn't really matter what color. Target cell, and it elicits a response. Yep, because we only have 10 more minutes. Okay? So the difference here is the interaction of the neuron as part of the stimulus. That's the only real difference, yeah. Yeah, neurotransmitters of sorts, or hormones. They could also be hormones too. So let's just call them hormones. I'm thinking neurotransmitter is usually more nerve to nerve, whereas chemicals that are moving from a brain tissue, the nervous system, into the bloodstream are typically more hormonal. No, what I'm saying is we use the word neurotransmitter more to describe the secretions of a nerve that are destined to interact with another nerve. Whereas these are destined to interact with cells outside of the nervous system. So hormone is a better descriptor of those particular cells. Okay? Because the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, although they're parts of the brain, they do release hormone molecules. So, okay? And that's the difference. So the main difference here is the fact that a part of the brain is involved. Then we can have what's called a neuroendocrine pathway. So this will be the last one. Neuroendocrine pathway. And here we get sort of a combination of the two sort of happening. So we start with a stimulus. There will be, the stimulus will be activating a sensory neuron, which will be connected to, again, usually the hypothalamus in this case. I'll wait for a second. Are we caught up? So the neuron would be interacting with the hypothalamus. In the brain. Hypothalamus, which would then be secreting these hormonal cells into the bloodstream. So there they go. And they'd be transmitted throughout the body. But what they would do, instead of directly affecting a target cell, it would act on an endocrine cell. So those little green guys would latch on here, and they would affect this endocrine cell, which is a gland. So in this case, the hypothalamus can basically regulate other glands and what they secrete. So endocrine cell, or basically a gland. And then the endocrine cell would have its little hormonal chemicals, which would then be released into the bloodstream again. There they go. And then they would find their way to effector cells of some kind. And the effector cells, I'll just squeeze it in here at the bottom, would elicit some kind of response. So this is a pathway where the brain stimulates an endocrine cell, another gland. So in the first pathway, the stimulus directly stimulates the gland to produce the hormonal excretion, travels through the bloodstream to get the response. In the second situation, you have the stimulus first affecting the brain. It affects the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary, which then secretes some sort of hormonal chemical that travels through the bloodstream to the effector cells to elicit the response. And thirdly, you have the combination of the two, where the original stimulus actually affects the brain through a neural connection first, and then the hypothalamus releases a chemical messenger hormone which travels through the bloodstream, but instead of going directly to the target cells, it goes to an endocrine gland elsewhere and causes that gland to do its job by releasing a second kind of hormone, which then travels through the body. So you can have direct gland to target cell, you can have brain to target cell, and you can have brain to gland to target cell. That's basically the three altogether. Okay? And one last thing that we should mention before we call it quits for the day. We'll draw a line here. We'll look at the way that these cells actually, or these hormones actually interact with cells. So, if you have a cell, here's the cell membrane, right? And on that cell membrane, there could be a receptor of some kind. Remember, the cell membrane is covered with all kinds of glycoproteins and glycolipids and receptors that are sometimes connected to protein gates and can change the permeabilities of membranes and do all kinds of things. So basically, a hormone molecule can attach directly to the cell like this. And then what it does is it changes the shape of that target cell. That receptor enables a chemical pathway to begin. So some chemical pathway, a molecule comes along, and it turns into a bunch of different molecules. So this is representing a chemical pathway of sorts, which produces a final cell, right? That the cell needs. And so this produces a response. This final molecule in this pathway. And it's in the cytoplasm. Okay, that's just different molecules being created in a biochemical pathway. Do you remember how you had glucose, phosphose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, and that's a biochemical pathway, right? One molecule turning into the next. This would stimulate or start off this process, and you would produce this final molecule with the X on it, which is something that's going to cause a response in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay? It's also possible that, let's draw the nucleus here in green, different membrane. It's also possible that one of these precursors that is being made here might be able to be passed through into the nucleus, and it would do something in the nucleus of the cell rather than in the cytoplasm. So we could put a nuclear response in there. Nuclear response. In order to do that, though, the molecule would have to be able to pass through the nuclear membrane. So they can act by interacting with cells on the outside of the cell membrane and cause a chemical reaction inside the cell. So the hormone itself never goes into the cell. It acts by activating a receptor site on the outside, which causes the chemical changes inside that it needs. Question? So the purple would be the actual receptor, the signal receptor. Let's call it the receptor on the surface of the cell. So you remember what I mean by that, right? Glycoproteins and different molecules stuck. Now the other thing that can happen is that if the hormone, I'll draw it as a square this time, if it's lipid soluble, then it doesn't need a receptor, and it can slide right through the membrane and into the cell. And if it does this, it could slide into the cell. Sorry about that. Not sure what that causing that, but it could slide into the cell, and it could slide through that membrane, and it could also slide directly into the nuclear membrane without any trouble. In other words, we don't need a biochemical pathway to make a new molecule, because this one can make its way all the way in. And then it could interact with DNA. I'll get to that in a minute. DNA, and perhaps it would interact with the DNA and it would cause some kind of response, like maybe it would cause the DNA to transcribe a particular protein. So let me just finish this writing down, right? I'll put response, a protein transcription. Okay, the green is the nucleus of the cell. Question? Yeah, so a water-soluble hormone cannot easily pass through a membrane. And so water-soluble hormones tend to act more on receptor sites outside the cell. And what they do is they initiate the sort of construction of the needed molecule through a biochemical pathway, which then can get into the cell and alter the DNA's response to transcription. But you can also have a fat-soluble, steroids, for instance. This is a good example of how steroids act. They can go right through because they're lipid-soluble, and they don't need this extra pathway. It's more of a direct contact with the nucleus. And that's basically it.